In Sparta, the price of perfection was life itself. A newborn was not a child, but a question. Would it serve the city or shame it? The elders decided by touch, by silence, by the curve of a spine. If the verdict was weakness, the sentence was exposure. Death by cold air and indifference. We remember Sparta for its glory. But beneath the marble of discipline lie the bones of the rejected. Who truly paid for this perfection? The chronicles are silent, the soil is not. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. It began with a law that no one dared question. Lycurgus, the semi-mythic lawgiver of Sparta, was said to have replaced family love with civic duty, turning reproduction into a matter of policy. The word eugeneia, good birth, became the city's obsession. Every womb, every cradle, every breath belonged first to the state. In most of Greece, birth was joy. In Sparta, it was inspection. To survive in Sparta was to be judged worthy of investment. The infant was property, not person, a future resource of the state. And that is how the miracle of Sparta was built, through selection, elimination, and silence. Every story of their courage begins here in this quiet horror, where the state first learned that the most efficient weapon is not the spear, but the ability to decide who deserves to exist. The private life of a Spartan did not exist. Even desire was a matter of legislation. The city-state had extended its hand into the most intimate chambers, replacing affection with arithmetic and turning courtship into a branch of statecraft. Marriage was not about love, it was about lineage. The Spartan magistrates, known as the Gerontes and Ephors, tracked bloodlines like merchants tracing cargo routes. They knew who was strong, who was fast, who had bred sons that survived battle. They studied bone structure, hips, and ancestry, the way farmers examined breeding stock. Who sired the child was not a moral question. It was a logistical one. Every union was arranged, approved, and recorded. You did not choose a partner. You were assigned one. Personal preference was weakness. Compatibility was a civic duty. The matchmakers of Sparta were not poets, but administrators mapping human bodies into the machinery of the state. Young men barely 20 were observed from childhood, evaluated for strength, obedience, and loyalty. Women were chosen for broad hips and athletic build, not charm or wit. If her mother had produced strong children, she was considered proven fertile. If her brothers had died bravely in war, her bloodline was considered pure. The ideal couple was not meant to love. They were meant to reproduce efficiently. This bureaucratic intimacy served a brutal logic. Sparta's survival depended on a small citizen class, the homoioi, the equals. Only their offspring could inherit full citizenship. Every weak birth, every barren marriage was a political threat. And so the state intervened. The city treated reproduction as infrastructure. Magistrates gave formal permissions for marriages, sometimes even ordering pairings between households to correct imbalances in lineage. The idea was simple. If two warriors' children die in infancy, breed their surviving sisters to other proven men. The state was pruning its human garden. Love, that uncontrollable force, was now classified as a potential rebellion. To fall in love without the state's approval was to prioritize personal emotion over collective purpose. Emotional loyalty was dangerous. It created bonds that could challenge the supremacy of the city. Some historians reading the few surviving Spartan inscriptions have found a chilling consistency. There are no love poems, no dedications from husbands to wives, no art showing affection between couples. Only the body, the athlete, the warrior, the mother of warriors. Intimacy was stripped to its functional minimum. Yet, even here, discipline turned into theatre. The Spartans claimed their system created stronger love, not weaker love of state. Love of the ideal love of strength itself. Women were told that desire must serve a higher goal. To bear a warrior was an act of worship. To love one man was selfish. To love Sparta was divine. A young woman who married in Sparta entered not a household, but a mechanism. Her wedding night would not be hers alone. Witnesses, sometimes family, sometimes magistrates, confirmed the union. It was not enough to love. One had to perform duty. If a husband failed to produce children, he could be ordered to share his wife with another man, one stronger, more proven in battle. The child would belong legally to the husband, but biologically to the state's choice. This was not adultery, but efficiency. If a man grew old, yet remained virile, he could father children with a younger woman already married to another. Love was dissolved in the acid of utility. Sparta was not ashamed of this. They saw it as rational. Other Greek cities called it barbaric, yet envied the results a population of disciplined, fearsome warriors. The philosopher Xenophon, who admired Sparta, wrote that the citizens obey as if they were limbs of one body. He meant it as praise. But hidden in that phrase lies the horror when the body becomes the state. The soul becomes obsolete. The private became public, and the public became sacred. To disobey reproductive law was treason. To choose your own partner was vanity. Even the timing of conception was regulated. Women were encouraged to conceive only after vigorous exercise to ensure strong offspring. The body was a battlefield long before the child became a soldier. Behind this system was an obsession, older than any law fear. Fear of decline, fear of impurity, fear of chaos, that comes when individuals start to dream for themselves. By controlling sex, Sparta controlled the future. This was the first great experiment in biological governance centuries before modern states would repeat its logic. And yet in its silent rooms, under its rigid rules, the seeds of decay were already sown. When the state decides who may love it, also decides who may exist. And no city, however strong, can survive when it teaches its people that tenderness is weakness and control is God. The Spartan wedding was not a celebration. It was a ritual of erasure. In most of Greece, marriage meant feasting music garlands, the joining of families. In Sparta, it meant silent shadows and the sound of a blade cutting hair. The bride was abducted by her groom in a ceremony so strange that even ancient observers struggled to describe it without unease. It was half theatre, half indoctrination, a performance that reminded both man and woman that personal affection was forbidden territory. Here is how it unfolded. The chosen woman, usually in her late teens, was taken at night, sometimes literally carried from her home by the man assigned to her. Her head was shaved. Her body was wrapped in a man's cloak, her feet left bare. She was then laid on a pallet in a dark room waiting. The groom, often a soldier in his 20s, entered silently from his barracks, consummated the marriage quickly, and left before dawn. No banquet, no witnesses, no vows. Just the sound of footsteps fading into the military dormitories, where he would continue to live until the age of 30. Love was not the point. The act itself was the lesson. By transforming the bride into a figure stripped of gender and identity, the state taught the man to suppress tenderness. The abduction was symbolic, a severing of emotional connection, a reminder that even pleasure belonged to the state. The woman's shaved head and male clothing blurred the line between feminine and masculine, between wife and soldier. It was as if Sparta was saying, "You belong to no one but the city." Every element of this ritual served a psychological function. The darkness removed the possibility of familiarity. The briefness of the encounter ensured emotional distance. The secrecy allowed the illusion that duty, not love, governed human union. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was engineering. The Spartan leaders understood something profound and terrifying. Love creates loyalty, and loyalty divided between family and state is dangerous. In Sparta, there could be no competing devotions. A husband who adored his wife might hesitate in battle. A father who cherished his child might question the state's right to send him to die. Therefore, love had to be ritualized into obedience. Even the frequency of visits between husband and wife was restricted. Until the age of 30, men lived in barracks. They were permitted only brief secret meetings at night. The idea, as Plutarch records, was that this would make the union more passionate and more fruitful. But the truth beneath that phrase was darker passion was permitted only when it served the system. Affection without state purpose was disorder. It was a kind of emotional rationing. By limiting intimacy, Sparta made desire serve discipline. The scarcity of touch became another form of control. The wedding then was not the creation of a household. It was the formation of a cell in a national organism. The husband was the soldier, the wife the reproductive vessel, the child, the future weapon. Each part existed not for itself, but for the machinery of the whole. And yet, for all its precision, the system carried an undertone of tragedy. Ancient travelers to Sparta described women who were beautiful, confident, and strong, yet strangely alone. They lived in homes with no warmth, surrounded by the silence of absent husbands and sons. The laughter of childhood was missing from Spartan streets. One Athenian visitor wrote bitterly, "The Spartans breed soldiers, not citizens." He was right. By turning marriage into policy, Sparta did not elevate discipline, it exiled humanity. The wedding night that began with abduction was the quiet prologue to a greater story of control, a story in which every heartbeat, every birth, every death would be measured, recorded, and justified as duty. In this city, even love was a weapon. And once the heart becomes a tool of the state, the soul has nowhere left to hide. It began with the cry of a newborn and ended with silence. In Sparta, birth was not a private moment of joy, but a civic inspection. The first sound of life summoned not a mother's embrace, but a committee. When a child was born, the midwives did not hand it to its mother. They wrapped it tightly and carried it through the streets to the Gerousia, the council of elders. These were men hardened by war and ritual men whose eyes had long ago learned to see human life as material. They sat in a circle waiting as if presiding over an auction rather than a birth. The inspection was swift, methodical, and without mercy. The infant was unwrapped, turned, stretched, examined. Did its limbs move with vigor? Did it cry with strength? Was the chest full, the head round, the spine straight? If yes, it was accepted, registered, and sent back to live. If not, it was carried to the apothetai, the pit at the base of Mount Taygetus, and left to die. The elders called it purification. Philosophers later called it order. But what it really was the transformation of moral atrocity into administrative routine. The Spartans had turned infanticide into policy. It was not a crime, it was a civic duty. To let a weak child live was considered an act of cruelty to the state. The law had no space for pity, because pity was seen as contagion. Compassion weakened the collective, therefore it was forbidden. The baby who failed the test was not murdered in the traditional sense. No one raised a sword, no one was punished. The law itself performed the killing silently, impersonally. It was bureaucracy disguised as nature. Every empire that followed would repeat this logic, distance the killer from the act. Turn violence into paperwork, call it necessity. Sparta was the prototype. Archaeologists have found bones at the base of Taygetus, small, fragile, mixed with animal remains. Whether every infant was truly thrown there or not, the message was clear. In this city, survival was a privilege, not a right. The inspection was not merely physical, it was ideological. A malformed limb was not just a defect, it was a symbol of moral weakness. To be born imperfect was to betray the city before taking your first breath. The philosopher Plutarch, centuries later, would try to justify it. He wrote, "They did not destroy the children, but spared them from a miserable life." Yet the cruelty lies precisely there in the rationalization. The Spartans had achieved something modern societies would learn to imitate. With terrifying precision, the ability to commit atrocity while calling it compassion. The mother, meanwhile, had no say. She could not weep. Publicly, grief was weakness. Spartan women were trained from girlhood to accept loss as service. To cry for a rejected infant was to defy the collective will. So she remained silent, her body still aching from childbirth, while the city judged the product of her labor. That silence, more than the act itself, is what haunts history. The silence of women whose tears had been nationalized. The silence of fathers forbidden to protest. The silence of a city so convinced of its virtue that it mistook extermination for order. And yet, within this cruelty was a grim efficiency. Sparta produced generations of strong, disciplined warriors. The system worked if one measures success by military endurance. But, at its heart, lay a paradox by killing the weak. Sparta made itself weaker in spirit. Each rejected child represented a possibility, a poet, a thinker, a craftsman erased for not fitting the single definition of usefulness. The city that claimed to perfect humanity had amputated everything human from its soul. This was the quality control of the ancient world, the intersection of ideology and flesh. It was not enough to conquer others. One had to conquer nature, reshape it to fit a civic blueprint. What began as a ritual of strength became the foundation of a philosophy, one that would echo through centuries, that a society can engineer virtue by eliminating imperfection. In the end, the apothetai was not merely a pit of bones. It was a mirror reflecting every empire, every ideology that believes it can perfect the human race by culling it. Sparta was not the last to throw its unwanted children from the mountain. It was simply the the first to call it law. At 7 years old, a Spartan boy ceased to be a child. He became a state asset. The transition was abrupt. One morning, soldiers arrived at his home, and his mother, trained in obedience, handed him over without protest. There were no tears. She had been taught since girlhood that grief was treason. Her son no longer belonged to her. He belonged to the city. The boys were taken to the agoge, the infamous Spartan training system, part military academy, part psychological crucible. The word itself meant upbringing, but that translation hides the violence within. Agoge was not education, it was reprogramming. Their new home was not a house but a barracks. Straw mats replaced beds. One coarse tunic replaced clothing for all seasons. Shoes were forbidden. The cold was an instructor. Hunger, a tutor. The state deliberately starved them not out of poverty, but philosophy. A hungry boy, they believed, was an alert boy. Deprivation sharpened both body and instinct. Each day began before dawn. The boys ran barefoot across frozen ground, recited war songs instead of prayers, learned to steal instead of beg. But the thefts were part of the curriculum. If you were caught, you were not punished for stealing. You were punished for incompetence. The lesson was brutal. Morality mattered less than mastery. They learned to survive by cunning, not compassion. The act of taking what one needed from another became not shame, but skill. By hunger, the state taught them a new ethics that success justified, the method that need was permission. Pain, too, was part of the syllabus. Floggings were public and constant. Whips lashed for hesitation, for failure, for poor posture, even for the wrong expression during drills. The boys were expected to thank their punishers. To show pain was to betray weakness. To flinch was to fail the experiment. They were not allowed to speak freely. Questions were traps. Answers was weapons. Every sentence had to be sharp, brief and purposeful. The instructors struck them for verbosity, teaching a lesson that would echo in history as Laconic speech. To survive, you learned silence. To think, you learned to conceal. Hunger became the foundation of character. It hollowed them into instruments. The empty stomach replaced the conscience, every instinct redirected toward endurance, obedience, and control. But the cruelty was not random. It was a system of transformation. The agoge was designed to break down individuality and rebuild it into something collectively usable. A boy's affection for his family was replaced with loyalty to his unit. His fear was redirected into discipline. His pain was recycled into pride. At night, they sang songs of victory and recited tales of warriors who died smiling. The dormitories smelled of sweat, straw, and ambition, a factory of bodies. Instructors called them wolves, and the boys began to believe it. To show tenderness was to regress into childhood, and childhood had already been abolished. What happened to joy? It was categorized as distraction. To laugh too much, to play too long, was to show a mind unfit for war. Even friendship had to be strategic. Every bond a rehearsal for hierarchy. Older boys dominated younger ones, turning companionship into apprenticeship under duress. It was state-sanctioned bullying with ideological purpose, to prepare future commanders to command through fear. Every system of total control begins with language, but every tyranny begins with hunger. In Sparta, both worked together. The agoge created men who could live without comfort, without choice, without mercy. And in doing so, it created soldiers who would obey any order, even one that contradicted their humanity. Archaeological excavations near the ancient barracks reveal small bronze plaques etched with names, short, identical, easily forgotten. They were inventory tags. Each represented a boy trained, inspected, and certified, a product of the system, a number in flesh. The agoge was a triumph of organization and a tragedy of the soul. For every soldier it produced, it buried a child. And in that paradox, the efficiency of the machine versus the death of innocence, lies the eternal warning of Sparta. A society that feeds on hunger will always starve itself in the end. There was one rule every Spartan boy learned before he could read. Pain is proof of worth. In the agoge, suffering was not an accident of discipline. It was its language. To hurt and not flinch was to be civilized. To show pain was to regress into the animal. The instructors said it openly. We do not teach you to avoid pain. We teach you to use it. Public beatings were a daily ritual. They happened during meals drills, even ceremonies. Boys were struck for failing to steal well, for walking too slowly, for speaking out of turn. But they were also beaten for no reason at all. Arbitrary cruelty taught them the deeper lesson that pain would come without warning, and the only defense was indifference. The lash became as familiar as breath. The first strike always drew blood, the next merely reinforced rhythm. Each wound was a small initiation, each scar a kind of citizenship. The boys would stare straight ahead as the whip bit into their backs, eyes, dry lips still. The crowd would cheer. This was not punishment. It was performance, a civic theater of stoicism. In time, the boys learned to compete in silence. The question was no longer, can you endure, but can you endure better than the boy beside you? Suffering became hierarchy. Pain became currency. The story every Spartan child knew was that of the fox. A boy once stole a fox cub to prove his cunning. When questioned by his teacher, he hid it under his cloak. The terrified animal clawed and bit into his stomach, tearing him open. The boy answered calmly until he dropped dead, still silent. To modern ears, it is a horror story. To the Spartans, it was a sermon. The lesson was clear. Death without weakness is triumph. The boy's corpse was an altar to the new moral order, one where restraint was the highest form of faith. Pain had replaced virtue. It no longer mattered whether an act was just kind or good. What mattered was whether one could endure. This was the great inversion. Cruelty became pedagogy, and endurance became holiness. Religion reinforced it. The god they prayed to most often was not Apollo or Aphrodite, but Artemis Orthia, the upright goddess patron of endurance and blood. At her altar, boys were whipped until they fainted or died. The audience, parents, elders, foreign visitors watched approvingly. Some even laughed. The blood on the marble was civic proof that Sparta still functioned. Plutarch, writing centuries later, could not decide whether to admire or recoil. They were taught to bear the lash with smiles, he wrote. For in Sparta, the gods loved those who felt pain beautifully. It was not metaphor. Beauty and pain had merged. The perfect body was not the unscarred one, but the one whose scars had healed symmetrically. To hurt elegantly was to belong. This system created soldiers who could withstand horror, but also men who could inflict it without hesitation. Empathy atrophied. Cruelty became efficiency. The same hand that refused to flinch under the whip would later drive a spear into another man's throat with the same calm precision. When a child learns that suffering is sacred, he grows into an adult who sanctifies the suffering of others. That was Sparta's dark genius, to forge morality from agony to convert trauma into theology. But it came at a cost invisible to the chronicles. Many of those boys did not live long. Infection took them. Malnutrition took them. Madness took some. Those who survived were the most disciplined and the most damaged. Pain had made them strong. Yes, but only in one direction. They were incapable of tenderness. Their strength was brittle, built on suppression, not balance. Historians often describe Sparta as the first society to industrialize human character. But what it really did was standardize trauma. It took the chaos of fear and systematized it into virtue. The Fox Boy's story ends where all such civilizations end in silence. He dies quietly honored for not crying out. But no one asks why a child must die to prove discipline. That question, the one Sparta erased, is the one that makes us human. Before a Spartan boy learned to wield a spear, he was taught to master his tongue. Speech in this society was not a right, but a weapon to be sharpened through pain and withheld like a blade. From the first days of the agoge, he understood that words were dangerous. They could expose fear, uncertainty, emotion. To speak too much was to betray one's mind. To speak poorly was to invite humiliation. Silence was safety. Inside the dining halls and courtyards, boys sat rigid as questions were hurled at them like spears. What is courage? What is justice? What is obedience? There were no correct answers, only traps. Hesitation could earn a beating. The wrong tone could invite mockery. And even the right answer, delivered too quickly, might reveal arrogance. They learned to pause, to calculate, to make each syllable as measured as a heartbeat. And when they did speak, it was brief, sharp, deliberate words that cut the air and left nothing to be added. From this crucible emerged a culture of verbal minimalism that would define Sparta's identity for centuries. The world would call it Laconic speech, named after Laconia, their homeland. But to the Spartans, it was survival itself. Every utterance carried the weight of potential punishment. Every silence was a shield. The discipline of speech was indistinguishable from the discipline of the body. A boy who learned to endure hunger learned also to endure quiet. As adults, they spoke with the same precision. They wielded their spears, few strikes never wasted. When the Persian envoy demanded Leonidas surrender his weapons, the king's reply, "Come and take them," was not mere defiance, but distilled philosophy. When Philip of Macedon threatened to destroy Sparta if he invaded the city, replied with one word, "If." These phrases would echo across history as symbols of confidence, but they were also evidence of fear of excess, of vulnerability, of exposure. In Sparta, the fewer the words, the stronger the armor. This linguistic austerity extended far beyond the barracks. It shaped politics, religion, even love. The Athenian believed eloquence was the essence of freedom, that argument and persuasion were the lifeblood of democracy. The Spartan believed the opposite, that eloquence was corruption, that too many words could dissolve obedience. In Athens, debate was art. In Sparta, it was infection. Athenian children were trained to speak to convince, but Spartan boys were trained to speak to conceal. Their silence became a kind of worship, an offering to the gods of discipline. Even the mothers learned it. Before battle, a Spartan mother would hand her son his shield and say, "Return with it or on it, not one word more." That phrase, chilling in its clarity, carried the moral code of an entire civilization: loyalty over life, silence over fear, duty over love. These women were not cruel, they were consistent. They spoke with the authority of the state, their voices echoing its iron law. Emotion was indulgence, and indulgence was treason. But the system that perfected silence also poisoned it. Beneath the calm exteriors and measured replies lay generations who had forgotten how to speak of tenderness, grief, or longing. Words for love existed in their language, but not in their culture. Their vocabulary had been militarized, each expression reduced to command, each conversation a performance of restraint. The same boys who learned never to cry grew into men who could not comfort fathers, who could not explain affection except through expectation. Husbands who mistook emotional distance for strength. Silence, once a tool of survival, became a prison without walls. What began as discipline turned into isolation. What began as order decayed into emptiness. The city that had conquered fear of the enemy had built an empire of fear within the self. Without dialogue, there was no doubt. Without doubt, no growth. They mistook stillness for stability, not realizing that silence unbroken becomes rot. To this day, the Spartan way of speaking remains admired, quoted by soldiers, leaders, and Stoics as the language of courage. And indeed, there is beauty in brevity, a certain poetry in words that strike like arrows. But the modern admiration often forgets the cost. Every perfect Spartan phrase was paid for by a lifetime of suppression. Each heroic retort carried the silence of 1,000 unspoken fears. They built a language that could win wars, but not one that could heal wounds, a society fluent in command, but mute in compassion. Their laconic words outlived their empire carved into marble and memory. Yet behind them echoes the same unasked question. What does a civilization lose when it chooses silence over speech, discipline over humanity? In that question lies the tragedy of Sparta. Not that they spoke little, but that in the end they no longer knew how to be heard. If the agoge was a forge, then pain was its fire and hierarchy its mold. Every Spartan boy lived under a pyramid of domination, where cruelty flowed downward and obedience upward. The system was built with terrifying simplicity. The oldest boys, called the Irenes, ruled the younger ones with absolute power. They were drill masters, judges, and executioners, all rolled into one. Their word was law, their moods unpredictable decrees. A wrong answer, a clumsy step, even an unlucky glance could bring punishment, a blow to the face, a night. Without food, a lashing before the group. The younger boys, desperate to survive, learned to read expressions like oracles, the tightening of a jaw, the flick of an eyebrow, the way a shadow fell before a strike. Every day was a lesson in vigilance. In this architecture of fear, brutality became not only normalized, but sacred a ritual of continuity. Each generation endured it, then inherited the right to inflict it. The agoge called this education. It was in truth a system of controlled terror. The older boys were encouraged to invent punishments to test the younger ones' patience, loyalty, and silence. They were told to teach them, but no lesson was written except the law of domination. A boy might be forced to sing in the cold until his voice cracked, or ordered to stand motionless for hours, while insects crawled across his face. Some were made to fight each other, blindfolded, their peers cheering as fists found flesh. Others were humiliated in front of the group for minor mistakes, enduring laughter that cut deeper than the whip. It was not enough to obey. One had to perform obedience beautifully. The cruelty was deliberate, systematic, and bureaucratic. The instructors watched, but rarely interfered. They understood that fear binds more tightly than affection, and humiliation, once internalized, becomes self-policing. By the age of 10, the boys had learned the essence of Spartan governance, that authority must hurt to be believed. This hierarchy mirrored the structure of the city itself. The Irenes were the miniature reflection of the ephors and kings, and the youngest boys their subjects. The cruelty of the barracks was a rehearsal for the cruelty of the state. When the boys became men, they would treat slaves, women, and enemies exactly as they had been treated, without pity, without pause. Sparta's political stability, so admired by outsiders, rested on this invisible chain of psychological conditioning. No written constitution could hold citizens in line like fear could. Each boy carried within him the memory of being beaten, and the certainty that to question power meant pain. In time, he would reproduce that logic on others. The philosopher Plutarch, centuries later, called the Spartan system a monarchy within a democracy, a tyranny within a brotherhood. It was the paradox at the core of their greatness: unity through degradation, loyalty through shared trauma. The agoge didn't just train soldiers, it trained successors in cruelty. There was, however, one more layer to this pyramid: the spectators. Pain in Sparta was never private. It was always observed. Public whippings, forced confessions, humiliations all took place before peers who learned through watching. A boy who did not participate in the cruelty became suspect, even weak. To hesitate was to risk becoming the next victim. In this way, the system transformed violence into a communal language. By laughing at another's suffering, one proved belonging. By striking without remorse, one demonstrated worth. The lines between punishment and ceremony blurred until they were indistinguishable. And so the boys learned to smile through pain, not only their own, but that of others. Compassion withered in the heat of applause. By the time they reached adulthood, the transformation was complete. The child who once flinched at cruelty now delivered it with composure. The agoge had fulfilled its purpose. It had not merely taught them to fight, it had taught them to live without mercy. The result was a society astonishing in discipline and terrifying in psychology. The same young men who could march into certain death at Thermopylae were also those who could beat a trembling child for speaking out of turn. They could endure suffering because they had learned to worship it. They could inflict suffering because they had been trained to see it as virtue. The pyramid of abuse was self-sustaining, self-justifying, and in a dark way self-admiring. Every lash, every scar, every act of domination reinforced the illusion that such brutality was necessary, even noble. Yet the cracks were already there. Some boys broke. Some turned violent beyond control, even toward their superiors. Others learned too well, using cruelty, not as duty, but as pleasure. Sparta's machine had no mechanism for forgiveness, only escalation. The pyramid could hold only as long as everyone believed in its sanctity, and belief, like discipline, must be renewed through suffering. That was the logic of Sparta to rule others. One must first learn to endure humiliation without flinching. To maintain order, one must destroy the capacity to question it. The agoge was not simply a training program, it was a philosophy of governance carved into flesh. And when we look back at the glory of Sparta, at the bronze statues and the poetry of war, we must remember the boys who bled in silence so that others could march in formation. They are the true architecture of that legend, the unseen scaffolding of its perfection. The cost of unity was cruelty. The price of loyalty was pain. And under every shining helmet of Sparta lay a child who had learned that to survive, one must first become the hand that strikes. At the heart of Sparta stood a small wooden idol, dark, primitive, almost crude. The goddess Artemis Orthia was not the gentle huntress of Athenian myth. She was older, harsher, nearer to the bone. Her altar, soaked in generations of blood, was the stage for one of the most disturbing spectacles in the ancient world. Every spring, Spartan boys gathered there for the diamastagosis, the flogging contest. It sounded ceremonial, even athletic. In truth, it was a public torture, masked as devotion. Before the altar lay heaps of cheese, a symbol of offering. The task seemed simple: run forward and seize as much as possible. But between the boys and the cheese stood older youths armed with leather whips hardened in salt and vinegar. When the signal was given, the air filled with the crack of lashes. The boys sprinted forward through a storm of pain, each blow cutting flesh from their backs. To fall was shame, to cry out was disgrace, to bleed was honor. The crowd roared. Mothers stood beside foreign spectators, watching their sons turn into living altars. In any other city, such cruelty would have been condemned as barbaric. In Sparta, it was theatre, religion, and education fused into one. The priests declared that Orthia demanded sacrifice, but no animals were killed. The victims were the citizens themselves, their bodies offered to prove the city's endurance. The ritual began as a punishment for theft, legend said. Centuries earlier, Spartan youths had stolen cheese from the goddess's temple. In retribution, she demanded blood. The Spartans institutionalized the myth, transforming punishment into pedagogy. Now, every cut was a lesson. Pain purifies obedience, sanctifies, suffering unites. The boys who endured longest, sometimes until death, were celebrated as martyrs of discipline. Theirs was not private pain, but collective pride, a performance that reinforced Sparta's grim theology that virtue is measured by the ability to suppress agony. The diamastagosis blurred the line between worship and spectacle, faith and propaganda. Outsiders came from across Greece to witness the spectacle of sacred endurance. By the Roman period, the ceremony had become a tourist attraction. Senators, poets, and travelers watched from stone benches as boys were whipped until their backs split open as blood sprayed across the altar, as priests sprinkled the wounds with ash. The screams that once signaled weakness became part of the entertainment. Even the goddess herself, the rough wooden idol, was said to have smiled when the pain was pure enough. Roman chroniclers described it with uneasy fascination, half horrified, half admiring. Here was a people who had turned torture into ritual perfection. Here was civilization performing its own brutality as art. For the Spartans, Orthia was not cruel. She was just. She gave meaning to their suffering, turning each lash into an affirmation that they were chosen to be strong. But beneath the chants and drums, there was a quieter truth. The ritual did not test faith. It manufactured submission. A boy who learned to smile while being beaten learned something far more useful to the state than piety. He learned how to suppress instinct, how to transform fear into pride, how to see pain as proof of belonging. This was the final lesson of the agoge, to erase the boundary between body and ideology. The more one bled, the more one was bound to Sparta. The ritual thus became a kind of national glue binding citizens to each other through the shared memory of wounds. In this sense, Orthia was not merely a goddess. She was a psychological instrument, the divine face of social engineering. Every stripe carved into a boy's skin was a signature of ownership, declaring, "You belong to us." And yet even in this theatre of endurance, cracks of humanity appeared. Some boys fainted and were dragged away to die in silence. Some mothers turned their faces from the sight, trembling behind their veils, torn between pride and terror. The priests said those who died beneath the whip were blessed, but the truth was simpler. The city had made pain sacred because it had nothing else left to offer. The diamastagosis was not a celebration of faith. It was the last stage of Sparta's experiment in control, the point where cruelty disguised itself as holiness. The Romans who visited saw only the spectacle, not the system behind it. They left impressed, calling it discipline. But what they witnessed was the final illusion of a dying creed, a civilization that had forgotten how to live, except through suffering. The altar of Orthia still stands in ruins today, its stones stained by centuries of rain. The blood is long gone, but the idea it represented that virtue can be beaten into the human body still lingers like a shadow across history. When a Spartan boy became a man, the final test of his education was not endurance, but murder. It was called the cryptia, the hidden war, a ritual so secretive that even ancient historians wrote of it in whispers. It began after the harvest, when the fields were heavy with grain, and the enslaved helots, those conquered Messenians who worked the land, prepared to store the food that fed their masters. On that night, the ephors, Sparta's highest magistrates, performed a simple but monstrous act of paperwork. They declared war on the helot population. The declaration was ceremonial, but its implications were lethal. By transforming slaves into enemy combatants, they made killing legal. The young initiates of the agoge, freshly graduated from years of controlled violence, were unleashed into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and a command to kill. Without mercy, kill without witness until fear itself had a name. The cryptia was not random slaughter. It was an algorithm of terror, a precise culling of potential rebellion. The young men were told to seek out the strongest helots, the ones who stood too tall, who spoke too clearly, who might inspire others to rise. They hunted by night, barefoot and silent, hiding in the fields they had once seen from afar. When dawn came, they vanished into the shadows, leaving behind bodies half buried in the dirt, their deaths disguised as accidents or disappearances. There were no trophies, no songs, no glory, only silence, and the unspoken understanding that the state had now burned empathy out of them completely. Those who hesitated were quietly expelled from the ranks of manhood. Those who killed efficiently were celebrated privately, their hands clasped by older men who had done the same. This was how Sparta renewed itself, not through law or philosophy, but through blood ritual disguised as civic duty. It was the purest expression of Spartan logic that survival required perpetual fear. The Helots vastly outnumbered their masters, and the only way to control them was to convince them that rebellion was death. But the Cryptia also served another purpose. It trained young Spartans to murder without moral residue. To kill in battle is easy. To kill unarmed civilians in darkness requires a different kind of discipline. The state understood this distinction perfectly. The Cryptia was less a campaign than a psychological operation designed to complete the process that began in childhood. It taught the young man to move through the world without conscience, to see obedience and atrocity as indistinguishable. Once he had killed a man in cold blood and returned unpunished, he was bound forever to the logic of the regime. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. From that night forward, his identity was not his own. He was a weapon, and weapons do not choose their targets. The cruelty of the Cryptia was matched only by its genius. It made terror self-sustaining. The Helots, broken by centuries of slaughter, learned to bow deeper to avert their eyes, to erase pride from their movements. At the same time, the young killers haunted, yet proud became the next generation of rulers, men who saw submission as natural and compassion as weakness. Every autumn, the cycle renewed itself. Bureaucrats signed the ritual declaration, youths vanished into the dark, and Sparta reminded itself that order demanded blood. To outsiders, this discipline looked divine, as though the gods had shaped the city from iron. But inside it was rot moral, spiritual demographic. A society that could survive only through murder was a society already at war with itself. The Helots ploughed the fields, but it was the Spartans who were enslaved, to fear, to habit, to the ghosts they created. The Cryptia had achieved its true goal, not merely to terrify the oppressed, but to transform the oppressor into a prisoner of his own obedience. And yet, centuries later, the world would still romanticize these men. Painters, poets, and soldiers would speak of Spartan courage as a model of discipline of noble restraint. They would remember Thermopylae, not the Cryptia, valor, not the murders in the fields. History loves the myth of bravery more than the reality of cruelty. But beneath the legend of the 300 stood the corpses of thousands who never had swords, whose names were never carved into stone. The Spartan dream of perfection of strength, purified through violence, was paid for by those invisible bodies. The Cryptia was not a footnote to Spartan greatness. It was its foundation. The night hunts ensured the day parades. The daggers in the dark guaranteed the gleam of bronze in the sun. And if the gods of Sparta were silent through it all, perhaps it was because even they could not tell the difference anymore between sacrifice and slaughter, between civilization and its shadow. While Spartan men were trained to kill, Spartan women were trained to create killers. Their education was no less political, only quieter disguised as freedom. In a world where Greek women elsewhere lived behind shutters and courtyards, Spartan girls ran through fields, wrestled, and raced in the nude beneath the same sun as their brothers. Outsiders saw emancipation. The reality was optimization. The state had learned that a starving mother births a starving soldier. Therefore, women were to be strong, fed well, and disciplined. They were not confined to weaving, but to breeding refined livestock in human form. "Give birth to men," said the lawgiver Lycurgus, and the message was clear. Their wombs were arsenals. From the moment they could walk, Spartan girls were measured for potential, praised for broad hips and sturdy legs, mocked for softness or sentiment. Their bodies were not their own, but the state's biological project. Education for Spartan women was an anomaly in Greece. They learned to read, to recite poetry, even to own property. They spoke boldly in public, a scandal to Athenian ears. But these privileges were not progressive, they were practical. The men lived in barracks until 30. Someone had to manage the estates. The women's literacy existed to maintain the machinery of the city, while its soldiers fought abroad. They read ledgers, not literature. They calculated rations, not philosophy. Their freedom was administrative, their power logistical. And yet, within this cage of utility, they learned to take pride in their function. Mothers praised one another, not for kindness, but for hardness. "I raised my son to die without fear." This was Sparta's most chilling success, the transformation of maternal instinct into patriotic duty. When a mother handed her son his shield and said, "Come back with it or on it," she was not quoting poetry. She was reciting state propaganda made sacred by repetition. This psychological conditioning was total. A Spartan woman who wept for a fallen son was shamed. One who smiled at the news of his death was celebrated. Love was permitted only when it aligned with civic purpose. The philosopher Plutarch wrote of one woman who killed her own child after he fled from battle, a story that might be myth, but reveals the city's moral code. Weakness was treason even in blood. Marriage itself was reduced to state mathematics. The magistrates arranged unions by pedigree and physical strength. Husbands were chosen for their lineage, wives for their reproductive health. If a pairing failed to produce strong children, the law encouraged borrowing. A man could be asked to impregnate another man's wife if his bloodline was superior, and no jealousy was permitted. In this exchange, women became vessels, men became breeding tools, and marriage became a contract of flesh managed by civic logic. Fidelity had no meaning. Love had no place. The city itself was the only family, its laws the only morality. To outsiders, Spartan women appeared formidable, commanding property, speaking boldly, walking with unguarded posture. But power in Sparta was always an illusion resting on obedience. Their strength was instrumental, their libido conditional. They were free only in the direction the state pointed. The philosopher Aristotle, observing this paradox, called Spartan women the ruin of Sparta. Claiming their influence led men to luxury. But he misunderstood their supposed boldness was not rebellion, but conditioning. They had been trained like their sons to believe that cruelty was virtue. They managed estates efficiently while others died abroad. Yes, but not because they were liberated. They were invested. Their entire sense of worth was tied to the quality of soldiers they produced. A barren woman was useless, a mother of cowards cursed. The state had colonized even their grief. In Sparta, the word woman did not mean tenderness or intimacy. It meant endurance. In silence the womb, as forge the body, as state asset. And yet, in the cracks of that system, faint traces of resistance flickered mothers who secretly mourned lovers, who risked affection, girls who dared to dream of gentleness in a city that worshipped hardness. But history did not record their names. Sparta erased softness as it erased weakness, and the women who lived behind that iron myth were buried under it, both victims and collaborators, in a system that demanded they mistake obedience for power. In Sparta, the word family did not mean what it did anywhere else. There were mothers, fathers, and children, but no true households. The state stood between every human bond, pruning emotion, like a gardener removes weeds. From the moment of birth, affection was a threat to discipline. Mothers nursed their infants not with lullabies, but with lessons. Do not cry. They whispered the state is watching. Fathers, meanwhile, barely existed in domestic life. They lived in the barracks, their nights governed by the mess hall, their intimacy rationed like their rations. A man might be allowed a brief visit to his wife, slipping into her bed in darkness forbidden to linger until dawn. There was no courtship, no warmth, no laughter at a shared table. Marriage was not companionship, it was state service. Children conceived in these furtive visits did not belong to their parents. They were the property of the city. The moment a child was born, it was seized, inspected, categorized. Only if it passed would it be returned for 7 short years before the agoge took it away. This architecture of separation was not accidental. It was the purest expression of Sparta's genius for control. The regime understood that love competes with loyalty. A soldier who loves his child may hesitate to die for his king. A mother who clings to her son might plead for mercy when the state demands sacrifice. So the city dismantled love itself. Emotional ties were recast as weakness, tenderness as betrayal. Even language adapted. The word philia, once meaning friendship, was narrowed to denote comradeship in arms, conditional, functional, purged of sentiment. The word eros, desire, was discouraged except as reproduction. The only sacred love permitted was between brothers in arms purified of sex, devoted to mutual endurance. It was intimacy without vulnerability, affection without softness. The system had found a way to sterilize even feeling to weaponize companionship into collective discipline. The home was no refuge. It was an annex of the barracks. What remained was ritual, not relationship. When a boy was taken to the agoge at age 7, no mother wept aloud. To cry was shame. To resist was treason. She was expected to stand still, her face carved into civic serenity as her child marched away. Her silence was patriotism. When that boy became a man, his first loyalty would be to his mess hall companions, not his kin. Even the act of eating was political. Every adult Spartan was required to dine communally, forbidden to eat with his own family. To skip the public meal was a crime against equality. At those mess tables, affection was measured by discipline, brotherhood by uniformity. The private life of emotion had been replaced by the public life of obedience. And so the city achieved what few societies ever dared. It abolished the family without abolishing childbirth. It preserved the function while erasing the feeling. Sparta did not destroy the household, it nationalized it. But the cost of this efficiency was incalculable. A society that cannot love cannot last. Every generation raised under the cold architecture of duty became more brittle, less human. The fathers who learned to suppress affection produced sons who mistook cruelty for courage. The mothers who repressed grief raised daughters who measured worth in pain. Over centuries, the absence of tenderness hollowed out the city's core. The people of Sparta could fight, but they could not nurture. They could die, but they could not dream. They had built the perfect military organism, self-replicating, self-regulating, utterly inhuman. And when that organism faced the shocks of time, war, loss, famine, it could not adapt. The family. The smallest engine of survival had been dismantled long ago. All that remained was the state, an immortal abstraction that could no longer protect the bodies it claimed to own. The Spartan experiment had proven its theory. Collective purity requires the destruction of private love. But the experiment also contained its failure. When every heart beats for the same cause, and none for each other. The first true death of a civilization is not military, it is emotional. The family that never was became the ghost that haunted all that Sparta built, the silence that echoed louder than the songs of its soldiers. Every empire dies from exhaustion before it dies from defeat. For Sparta, that exhaustion began at the biological level. Each Spartan citizen was the result of 30 years of controlled breeding inspection and indoctrination, a weapon handcrafted by the state. But when the wars multiplied, those weapons shattered faster than they could be replaced. A Spartan soldier's death on the battlefield was not merely the loss of a life, it was the loss of a 30-year investment, the collapse of an entire social equation. Unlike other Greek cities, Sparta could not replenish itself with foreigners or freedmen. Citizenship was inherited, not granted, and the purity of the bloodline was its cage. As wars drained the city, the number of full citizens, the homoioi, the equals, plummeted. From 8,000 in the city's golden age to fewer than 1,000. By its twilight, the citizen body withered into statistical insignificance. Each dead warrior meant fewer fathers, fewer sons, fewer defenders. And because the system could not bend, it began to crack. The economy followed the same arc of decline. Spartan wealth had once been measured in land, not currency, in communal simplicity rather than luxury. Lycurgus, the semi-mythical lawgiver, had banned gold and silver to preserve equality. But conquest and tribute poisoned that purity. After Sparta's victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, silver began to flow into the city, like rot beneath marble. The laws could forbid coinage, but they could not forbid greed. Land ownership concentrated in fewer hands. Inheritance laws favored male heirs and wealthy families. The mess halls, once symbols of Spartan equality, became tools of exclusion. A man too poor to contribute his share of food lost his citizenship. Poverty was not an accident, it was erasure. By the 4th century BCE, entire classes of once equal Spartans were disqualified from public life, replaced by a hollow elite. The homoioi were no longer equal, they were relics, the last specimens of a dying genetic experiment. The machine that had demanded uniformity now devoured itself through inequality. Even their discipline, the one virtue Sparta worshipped, began to corrode. Why sleep on reeds and eat barley broth when your neighbor dined on silver plates? Why endure the barracks when the wars that had justified them had already been won? As the economy stratified, so did morality. The austerity that once defined Spartan life gave way to quiet indulgence. Women, now wealthier through inheritance, controlled vast estates. The few remaining men found themselves outnumbered, dependent on the same social class their laws had once subordinated. Aristotle, observing from afar, saw the irony clearly. The men are ruined by their women, and the women by luxury. But the philosopher misread cause for symptom. The women were not the disease. They were the residue of a system that had devoured its men. Behind the marble facades and bronze shields, Sparta was hollow. It had perfected the art of survival until it no longer remembered how to live. And then finally, the exhaustion turned outward visible for all of Greece to see. The Theban general Epaminondas, confronting the Spartan army at Leuctra in 371 BCE, faced not gods of war, but men drained of vitality. His innovation was simple, but devastating. A tactical wedge 50 men deep that shattered the Spartan phalanx in one blow. When the dust cleared, 400 of Sparta's finest lay dead, including its king. That single afternoon ended 3 centuries of terror. For a city whose population had already fallen below 2,000, it was demographic suicide. Sparta survived in name, but not in spirit. Its slaves rebelled. Its allies defected its sons, no longer returned with shields or on them. The empire of exhaustion had reached its logical conclusion, perfection collapsing under its own arithmetic. The state that had tried to eliminate weakness found that fragility had simply moved inward, hiding inside its very strength. The perfect machine had run out of fuel because that fuel was human. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE was more than a defeat. It was the moment the Spartan illusion collapsed under the weight of its own perfection. For 3 centuries, the city had convinced Greece that its warriors were invincible, that discipline could outlast numbers, that breeding could replace innovation, that fear could substitute for loyalty. But on that summer afternoon in Boeotia, the myth met mathematics. The Theban general Epaminondas had studied the Spartan system the way a surgeon studies a patient's pulse before the incision. He knew they would never break formation, never improvise, never deviate from the sacred geometry of the phalanx. So, he designed a formation that exploited that faith. He massed his troops 50 men deep on the left flank, 5 times denser than any army before, and drove it directly at the Spartan right, where their king Cleombrotus stood. The Spartans advanced in perfect rhythm, their shields interlocking like iron teeth. But this time, precision became paralysis. When the Theban column hit, it didn't clash, it crushed. The first Spartan lines held for moments before buckling under sheer momentum. Then the disciplined became the drowned, their formation too rigid to retreat, too proud to flee. 400 citizen soldiers died that day, including their king. For a city that measured its identity in its men, it was an extinction event. The consequences were catastrophic, not just militarily, but philosophically. Sparta's authority over Greece had rested on intimidation, a mythology of divine invulnerability. When Leuctra shattered that mythology, everything else followed. Allied states in the Peloponnese, once obedient out of fear, rebelled. The Messenian helots, enslaved for generations, rose in revolt, founding their own free city. For the first time in centuries, Sparta's fields belonged to someone else. Economically, it was as if the veins of the state had been cut open. Without helot labor, the Spartans could not feed themselves. Without their citizen army, they could not reclaim it. The machine that had consumed so many lives to preserve its strength now found itself defenseless, not because its enemies were stronger, but because its own design had no mechanism for repair. The agoge had created soldiers who could endure anything except change. They were trained to die, not to adapt, and so they died precisely as trained beautifully, uselessly, predictably. In the aftermath, Sparta entered a long twilight of mimicry and denial. Its leaders continued to perform the rituals of the old state inspections, communal meals, military drills like priests repeating the prayers of a dead god. But the essence was gone. Foreign visitors came not to fear the Spartans, but to watch them as one might watch exotic animals performing the remnants of instinct in captivity. Even the ritual flogging at the altar of Artemis Orthia, once a test of courage, became a spectacle for tourists. Roman aristocrats later visited to see boys whipped to blood for entertainment, their endurance commodified for applause. The training that had once produced terror now produced theatre. The discipline that had once been religion was now reenactment. Sparta, the city that had built itself as a living machine, had become a museum of its own cruelty. Its soldiers, once feared by kings, now danced for coins under the same laws that had made them gods. The fall of the machine was not only military or social, it was psychological, when a civilization defines itself entirely by strength. Every victory feeds arrogance, and every defeat annihilates identity. The Spartans had no art to comfort them, no philosophy to reinterpret failure, no literature to translate loss into meaning. Athens, when conquered, left behind tragedy, dialogue, and memory. Sparta left silence. Its perfection had excluded the very tools that could have saved it: imagination, empathy, reform. Athenian thinkers, watching the ruin, understood the irony too late. They had once envied Spartan order, now they pitied its emptiness. Perfection, they realized, is not a state of grace. It is a state of decay, frozen at its peak. The Spartan system had reached its summit the day it was conceived. Every generation after was merely repetition, imitation, exhaustion. At Leuctra, the machine didn't just break it, proved that no society can mechanize humanity without first mechanizing its own demise. Sparta died not because it was weak, but because it refused to be human. Among the scattered stones of Sparta, nothing speaks louder than what is missing. No marble palaces, no libraries, no philosophers' schools, only the bare earth and a few ruins where boys once bled for the gods. The silence of the site is its own accusation, a civilization that invested every breath into control, left no room for creation. When later travelers came centuries after its fall, they searched for monuments and found only emptiness. The Spartans had not written their legacy in stone or words, but in bodies. Bodies that decayed, bodies that vanished. The ruins of Athens spoke of imagination. The ruins of Sparta whispered obedience. And obedience does not endure. The lesson of Sparta is not about military discipline or heroism, it is about entropy. A society that seeks to eliminate weakness ends by eliminating renewal. It perfects itself to death. The human spirit deprived of softness starves. Even the bones grow silent in a city that forbade mourning. Yet Sparta's ghost survived in a different form. Its ideals reincarnated wherever power hungers for purity. The dream of breeding the perfect human did not die with the hoplites. It merely changed costume. 2,000 years later, new ideologues resurrected the same logic in laboratories and parliaments. They spoke of racial hygiene, social fitness, genetic selection. The same cold calculus that once sorted Spartan infants now appeared in eugenic registries and sterilization laws. The rhetoric evolved, but the reasoning remained. Weakness is a flaw to be corrected, not a condition to be understood. The modern state learned from Sparta that compassion slows efficiency, that individuality disrupts order, that the body can be catalogued, optimized, disciplined. What Sparta tested with bronze and ritual, later empires tested with science and bureaucracy. And just as the Spartan council justified infanticide as civic duty, modern governments justified sterilization as progress. The vocabulary of perfection is always the same, clean, rational, bloodless, and it always ends in graves. Sparta's tragedy lies in its success. For centuries, it achieved exactly what it set out to do, to build citizens who did not question soldiers, who did not feel mothers, who did not cry. Its failure came only when that very success made it obsolete. The system had produced weapons so efficient, they could not evolve people so conditioned, they could not imagine alternatives. That is why Sparta's collapse is not a historical accident. It is a philosophical inevitability. Every civilization that defines strength as the absence of emotion will reach the same end. The architecture of control cannot tolerate its own architects. In trying to eliminate chaos, Sparta erased its capacity for change. In sanctifying discipline, it destroyed the soul of courage. The same walls that kept fear out also kept humanity in. And when those walls cracked, nothing living remained inside. That is why the modern fascination with Spartan virtue, the admiration for its simplicity, its rigor, its order, misses the essential horror. The Spartan way did not fail because it was too brutal. It failed because it was too perfect. Look closely at the ruins today, and the silence resolves into a warning. The dry riverbeds, the empty theatre, the altar of Orthia, all are monuments to a civilization that mistook survival for purpose. The real lesson of Sparta is not in its wars, but in its absence of life afterward. It teaches that societies are not sustained by discipline alone, but by empathy, imagination, contradiction, the very things Sparta exiled. When strength becomes ideology, it turns inward, feeding on its own flesh until nothing remains but ritual. We remember Sparta for its endurance, but endurance without renewal is petrification. The final truth is paradoxical. The city that sought to live forever built the most efficient machine for extinction the world had ever seen. The ruins are not just historical, they are prophetic. Every power that dehumanizes in the name of order, every ideology that trades love for control, walks the same road. The stones of Sparta whisper to every age perfection is the slowest form of death.